There is a river that carved the Grand Canyon over 6 million years, a force of nature so powerful it cut a mile deep into solid rock, and today it does not reach the sea. The Colorado River, the single most important river in the American West, the lifeline for around 40 million people across 7 states, no longer completes its own journey. It dies in the desert of northern Mexico, tens of miles short of the ocean it fed for millions of years, its final stretch a bed of cracked sand where a great river used to pour into the Gulf of California. Most people do not know that. They imagine the Colorado still running full and wild all the way to the sea. It does not, and it has not for decades. The river already hits zero. It just hits zero at the bottom, at the very end, where almost no one is looking. And here is the terrifying part. That zero is not staying at the bottom. It is climbing. The dead, dry end of the river is creeping back upstream year by year toward the cities and the farms and the 40 million people who built their entire civilization on the assumption that the water would always arrive. The question is no longer whether the Colorado can run dry. Part of it already has. The question is how far up the river the drying climbs before it reaches you. Because a total water emergency across 7 states does not begin the day the river is completely gone. It begins the day the demand finally, permanently outstrips the supply, and the giant reservoirs that have been hiding that gap for decades finally run empty. And that day is no longer a distant fear. The math that governs this river now points at zero, and the only thing standing between the modern West and a genuine water emergency is a buffer that is nearly used up. So let me show you what it actually means for the Colorado to hit zero, why it is happening, and what a total emergency across 7 states would really look like. Because this is not a story about a bad drought. It is a story about a river that is being asked to give more than it has, until one day it has nothing left to give. Picture a fishing village near the mouth of the Colorado on the Mexican side, the kind of place that lived for generations on the meeting of the great river and the sea. There were people here whose grandfathers cast nets into brackish channels thick with fish and shrimp, in a delta so rich it was called a place of almost unimaginable abundance. Now stand there and look at what remains. The boats sit on cracked mud, far from any water. The channels the fishermen once worked are dry veins in a salt-crusted plain. The fish are gone, because the fresh water that mixed with the sea to create their nursery simply stopped coming, pulled off upstream by cities and farms that most of these families will never see. An entire way of life, built on a river that always arrived, ended when the river stopped, and the people who watched it happen were among the first human beings to live through what it means when the Colorado hits zero. They are not a warning about the future. They are the past tense of this story, already living in the aftermath, on the dead end of a river that used to feed them. Let me start where the river already ends, because the future is visible there right now. Go to the Delta, the place in northern Mexico where the Colorado once spread out into a vast green wetland before meeting the sea. For millions of years, this was one of the great river deltas of the continent, a sprawling maze of channels and marshes teeming with birds and fish, where fresh water and salt water met in an explosion of life. Today, walk out onto that same ground and you find a desert. Cracked mud. Salt-crusted flats. The skeletons of the channels the river used to fill, now dry veins in a dead landscape. The water simply never arrives because every drop of it has been pulled out upstream by the cities and the farms of 7 states before the river can finish its course. That green delta is gone, replaced by a wasteland that was drowned in life within living memory and is now a monument to a river drained dry. This is what zero looks like. Not a dramatic disappearance, but a slow retreat of the water up the channel, leaving the dead riverbed exposed behind it. And that dead zone, that dry scar where a river should be, is not staying where it is. It marks the front line of a drying that is advancing upstream toward everyone who still assumes the Colorado will always run. And the death of the river is not only a human tragedy, it is the collapse of an entire living world that evolved around the water. The Colorado once supported fish found nowhere else on Earth, species that adapted over millions of years to its wild, silty, seasonal flows. And as the river has been dammed and drained and reduced, many of them have been driven to the edge of extinction, clinging to the last fragments of habitat. The cottonwood and willow forests that lined the banks, the green ribbons of life running through the desert, have withered as the water table dropped beneath them. The delta wetlands that were one of the most important stopover points for migrating birds on the continent, feeding millions of them on their long journeys, have largely dried up, and the birds that depended on that oasis in the desert have nowhere to land. When you drain a river, you do not just take water away from people. You unravel every living thing that spent millions of years learning to depend on it, from the fish in the current to the birds in the sky, and that web does not simply reweave itself when the flows are gone. The drying river leaves a dead ecosystem in its wake, and that death, too, is climbing upstream. To understand how a river this mighty can hit zero, you have to understand a gap at the very center of it. A gap between what the river is promised to deliver and what it actually carries. The Colorado has been overpromised from the very beginning. When its waters were divided among the 7 states by an agreement in the 1920s, the people doing the dividing measured the river during an unusually wet stretch of years, and they carved up more water than the river actually provides in a normal year, far more than it provides in a dry one. From day one, the paper promises added up to more water than the river held. That gap between the promise and the reality is called the structural deficit, and it is the key to everything. It means that even in a perfectly average year, more water is scheduled to be taken out of the river than flows into it. The system runs at a loss every single year by design. For a long time, that deficit was invisible because there was a buffer to cover it. But a system that spends more than it earns year after year is not sustainable, no matter how large its savings. And the Colorado has been running exactly that kind of deficit for decades. Hitting zero for this river does not require the flow to literally stop at the headwaters. It only requires the buffer that has been covering the structural deficit to finally run out, and then the gap between promise and reality becomes a real, physical shortage felt all at once. And it is worth understanding that the entire modern Southwest was built, quite deliberately, on that phantom water. In the 20th century, on the strength of those over-generous paper promises, the government threw dams across the river and dug canals hundreds of miles into the desert, and on the water they delivered. An astonishing civilization rose where almost none could have existed before. Las Vegas, Phoenix, and the sprawling metropolis of Southern California grew into some of the largest and fastest-growing population centers in the country. In some of the harshest desert on the continent, watered entirely by the imported Colorado. Millions of acres of farmland bloomed in valleys that had been bone dry. An entire way of life, air-conditioned and green-lawned and endlessly expanding, was constructed on the promise that the river would always deliver what the paper said it would. But the paper was wrong from the start. The growth was real. The concrete and the cities and the people are real, but the water underneath the whole enterprise was partly an accounting fiction, a river that existed on paper, but not in the channel. And now, a century later, the fiction is colliding with the physical reality of a smaller river, and the enormous civilization built on the difference between them is discovering that the foundation was never fully there. And that buffer is the thing most people mistake for the river itself. It is the great reservoirs. The reason the structural deficit has been survivable for so long is that the river was dammed to create 2 enormous reservoirs, Lake Powell behind Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam, the two largest in the country. Think of them as giant savings accounts of water. In wet years they filled, and in dry years they were drawn down to cover the gap between what the river provided and what the states demanded. For decades, those reservoirs were so vast that they hid the structural deficit completely. The states could take their full paper allocations, the deficit could quietly drain the savings, and no one felt a thing, because the accounts were so large. But savings accounts that you withdraw from every single year without ever fully refilling them only go one direction. Over the past 2 decades, those two reservoirs have fallen and fallen, their surfaces dropping toward the critical lines, exposing the stark white bathtub rings on the canyon walls that mark where the water used to be. Over 100 feet of missing water painted onto the rock. The reservoirs have fallen to the lowest levels since they were first filled, and when those savings accounts hit empty, the buffer is gone, and the river's flow to the people below effectively hits zero because there is nothing left to release. The reservoirs are not a second river. They are the last cushion, and the cushion is nearly spent. Now, some people will say this is just a drought, and droughts end. That is the most dangerous misunderstanding of all, because what is happening to the Colorado is not only a drought, it is something worse. A drought is temporary. It is a dry stretch that eventually breaks, the rains return, and the river recovers. But scientists studying the Colorado increasingly use a different word, aridification, which means not a temporary dry spell, but a permanent shift to a drier climate. As the region warms, the very nature of the river is changing in ways that do not reverse when it rains. Higher temperatures mean more water evaporates from the reservoirs in the soil before it can reach the river. Warmer air pulls more moisture out of the snowpack and the plants. The mountain snows that feed the river melt earlier and yield less runoff. The result is that for every degree of warming, the river loses a measurable share of its flow, and the region has been warming for decades with more to come. This is the crucial difference. A drought subtracts water temporarily. Aridification shrinks the river permanently, resetting it to a smaller size that the old promises were never written for. So even the wet years now deliver less than the wet years used to, and the baseline the whole system depends on is sliding downward for good. The Colorado is not just having a bad stretch, it is becoming a fundamentally smaller river. And a smaller river cannot fill promises written for a bigger one, no matter how the weather turns. So what does a total water emergency across 7 states actually look like when the buffer finally empties and the shrinking river can no longer cover the promises? It looks like the crisis arriving everywhere at once, which is what makes it a total emergency rather than a local one. Picture the reservoirs falling below the lines where the dams can still release water downstream. In the lower basin, the canals and aqueducts that carry Colorado water across the desert to Phoenix, to Tucson, to Las Vegas, and to Southern California begin to run dry, and cities holding many millions of people built in a desert on the assumption of endless imported water, face cuts that climb from their farms into their neighborhoods. In the upper basin, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, the towns and farms that draw from the river high in its course face their own shortages and are legally pressured to send water downstream to satisfy century-old obligations even as they go short themselves. The farms that grow a huge share of the nation's produce lose the irrigation that made the desert bloom. All of it happening in the same window across a region the size of several countries, because they all drink from the same river and the same emptying reservoirs, and when the shared source fails, it fails for everyone lashed to it simultaneously. This is not a shortage that moves politely from one town to the next. It is a single, continental-scale emergency striking 1/7 of the country at once. And imagine living inside it. A family in a Phoenix suburb turns the tap and the pressure is gone. In a metro area of nearly 5 million people, where the summer temperatures routinely pass 110 degrees and going without water is not an inconvenience, but a threat to life. A farmer in the Imperial Valley watches the canal that fed his fields for generations run to a trickle in the middle of the season. His crop and his livelihood dying in the ground. A retiree in Las Vegas, a city that draws almost all its water from a single dying lake, watches the news tell her that the straw reaching the bottom of that lake is running out of water to pull. Multiply those scenes by tens of millions of people across cities and farms and small towns spread over 7 states, all hitting the wall in the same terrible summer, and you have something this country has never faced. A water emergency not in one city or one valley, but across an entire region that holds a huge share of the nation's people, its produce, and its economic engine. The scale is the horror. There is no neighboring region with spare water to rescue this one, because the crisis is bigger than any rescue. And riding along with the loss of water comes the loss of power, because the same dams that store the water also generate electricity. Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam are not only reservoirs. They are massive hydroelectric power plants, generating clean electricity for millions of people across the West. And that power depends on the water level, because it is the weight and flow of the water through the turbines that spins them. As the reservoirs fall toward the critical lines, the dams generate less and less electricity, and below a certain level, they stop generating altogether. So the same crisis that takes the water also takes a major source of the region's power, and it does so at the worst possible moment, in the blazing heat of a desert summer when the demand for electricity to run air conditioning is at its absolute peak. Worse still, some of that hydroelectric power is used to pump water through the very canals that move the river across the desert. So the failing water supply and the failing power supply feed on each other, a system starving from 2 directions at once. A total emergency on the Colorado is not only about empty taps, it is about darkened homes and failing pumps in 115-degree heat, the water and the power collapsing together. Then the emergency reaches the dinner table of the entire country, far beyond the 7 states. The farms that draw on the lower Colorado, in Arizona, and in the desert valleys of California grow an enormous share of the vegetables that the whole nation eats, especially in winter. A huge portion of the lettuce and leafy greens on American tables in the cold months comes from that desert, grown with Colorado River water. So when the river hits zero and those farms lose their irrigation, the shelves 2,000 miles away go thin and the prices spike, and a family that has never heard of Lake Mead pays the price of a river they did not know their salad depended on. This is why the drying of one river is a national emergency and not a regional one. The Colorado does not just fill glasses in Phoenix and Las Vegas. It grows food for a continent and powers millions of homes, and when it fails, all of that fails together, and the failure radiates outward across the entire country through the grocery aisle and the power grid. And it is not only the vegetables. A large share of the water drawn from the Colorado goes to growing alfalfa and other hay, the feed that stands behind the region's cattle. It's beef and it's dairy. So the river is woven invisibly into far more of the American diet than most people realize, into the milk and the cheese and the meat as much as the winter lettuce. When the river hits zero, it does not just empty a produce shelf here and there. It pulls at the foundation of a whole segment of the nation's food production at once, the crops and the livestock together, so that the price of the drying river shows up across the grocery store rather than in a single aisle. A river most Americans could not point to on a map is quietly built into their breakfast, their lunch, and their dinner, and the day it can no longer deliver, they will finally learn how much of what they eat was riding on it. And if you are wondering how close all of this really is, The answer is the most sobering part of the whole story. This is not a scenario for the distant end of the century. The reservoirs have already fallen to the lowest levels since they were filled, into the range where, for the first time in history, the federal government has been forced to declare official shortages and impose real cuts on Arizona, Nevada, and California, with deeper cuts proposed as the crisis worsens. The system has already crossed from theory into action. Water is already being taken away from farms and cities right now, today, not as a drill, but as a response to a shortage that has already arrived. Officials have openly modeled the scenarios where the reservoirs fall below the levels needed to generate power or to release water downstream at all, and those scenarios are no longer treated as far-fetched. They are treated as risks to be planned against within years, not generations. Every dry winter pushes the levels closer to the edge. The thresholds that were once spoken of as unthinkable are now lines the water is actively sliding toward, close enough that the people who manage this river talk about them not as if but as when. The emergency is not waiting over the horizon. Its opening stages are already here, and the full version is close enough that the only real uncertainty is which dry year finally tips it over. So why can no one stop it, if everyone can see it coming? Because the 7 states cannot agree on who gives up water, and the river will not wait for them to decide. For years they have negotiated, trying to settle who will take deeper cuts to keep the reservoirs from crashing, and they cannot reach a lasting deal. Because every state is fighting to protect its own share, and none will volunteer to be the one that sacrifices most. The old rules reward the states with senior rights for protecting their seniority and force the junior users to bleed first, so the incentives push everyone toward conflict rather than cooperation. Meanwhile, the fixes people dream of, desalinating seawater, piping water from distant rivers, all turn out to be far too small or too expensive to replace a river that serves 40 million people, and none of them can be built in time. Conservation and recycling help at the edges, but cannot close a structural deficit this large against a river that is permanently shrinking. So the negotiations grind on while the reservoirs keep dropping, each state calculating that it is better to fight for its full share than to give up water voluntarily. In a slow-motion game of chicken with the water supply of 1/7 of the nation as the prize. And the river, indifferent to the lawyers and the meetings, keeps getting smaller. Stand on the banks of the Colorado in a place where it still runs strong, up in the canyons, and it is almost impossible to believe that a river this powerful could ever be brought to zero, that something so vast and ancient and alive could simply run out. But it already runs dry at the bottom, its delta a dead salt flat where a sea of life used to be. The reservoirs that hid the shortage for decades are nearly empty, their white rings climbing the canyon walls. The climate is making the river permanently smaller, so that even the good years deliver less than they used to. The promises still on paper add up to more water than exists, and not one of the 7 states will be the first to give up its share. The dead zone at the mouth of the river is not staying at the mouth. It is climbing, year by year, up toward the cities and the farms and the 40 million people who assumed the water would always come. The Colorado does not have to vanish entirely to trigger a total emergency. It only has to fall far enough that the promises can no longer be kept and the reservoirs can no longer cover the gap, and it is very nearly there. The river that carved the Grand Canyon is being asked to give more than it has, and the day it finally cannot. The emergency that has been creeping up its channel from the dead delta will arrive, all at once, at the doorstep of the modern West, which built everything it has on a river that was always, quietly, running out. The Grand Canyon took the river 6 million years to carve. It has taken us less than a single century to drink it down to the edge of zero. And the water does not care about our compacts or our cities or our promises. It only obeys the arithmetic. and the arithmetic at last has run out of room to hide.